Why do high-performing organisations like NASA start normalising risk, like with the O-rings, and effectively choosing luck over logic when the pressure is on?
It's not that organisations like to normalise risk so much as try to better understand it. Human spaceflight is never, ever going to be 100% safe. But then again, walking out of your house in the morning is never 100% safe. It's up to you how you understand that risk and how you deal with it. So there are lots of different elements that go into the decision-making process. But I think what happened with Challenger, unfortunately, is that they weren't successful at communicating the risk from the engineers up to the people who really needed to hear it, those making the final decision on whether to launch. And that is a really critical point here. It was a technical issue that they were vaguely aware about. They had seen something happen on a shuttle launch in 1981 and even set up a special task force to look at it. The problem was, because there hadn't been a disaster, there became this normalization of deviance. That's a phrase coined by Diane Vaughan in 1996, having studied the Challenger disaster. So even though it was an area of focus and study, they continued because they hadn't had a problem. And the engineers at Morton Thiokol, who are the ones who made those solid rocket boosters, they were the ones expressing that they were concerned about the O-ring, especially at such low temperatures. They didn't want the shuttle to fly. But the burden of proof as to why it was such a big issue was almost impossible to meet, because they were asked to prove that it would definitely cause a failure. And of course, that's something much harder to do. There was pressure to launch. NASA was trying to ensure they could fly regularly and reliably in every month of the year with the space shuttle. And I guess they had been, pretty successful up to that point. Space travel was starting to become normalized. It was a more regular thing. And it's just really unfortunate that this disaster was what it took for everybody to just pause and look at the processes that they were using and try and figure out better ways to ensure that concerns were listened to and were heard at the right levels by the right people, rather than dismissed.
To what extent have lessons from the Challenger influenced modern decisions to prioritise crew safety, such as choosing backup options or redundancies, like returning astronauts on a different spacecraft rather than accepting additional risks?
NASA has had to learn some very hard lessons, and crews have been lost over the years, starting with the Apollo 1 crew, then of course with Challenger and then Columbia. And it's interesting to see when the Boeing Starliner test flight was taking place, and those two veteran astronauts took the spacecraft up to the International Space Station, and there were some issues with the thrusters and a lot of discussion about whether they should come home in that vehicle or wait to come back in a SpaceX Crew Dragon vehicle instead. Now, on the basis that they did have another option, they chose safety first and used the option that had been tried and tested previously and brought them home in the Dragon capsule. And I think this really speaks to the fact that they have learned the hard way. And it's some of those very same people who were there having to make those incredibly tough calls about what to do. But in this instance, because they had the two different spacecraft, they had dissimilar redundancy, as we would say in the space industry, it enabled them to get the crew home safely and still bring back Starliner without a crew and make sure they could really fully understand all of those issues before it flies again.
Do you see Challenger as just a space disaster, or a broader warning about what happens when leadership stops listening to engineers, and have we learned the lessons from then?
Now, what caused the Challenger disaster was not only a failure of engineering, but a failure of communication. And I think that's not something that is unique to the space industry. In fact, large organizations, they may say they have warning systems in place, perhaps whistleblower protections, but if things at the end of the day rely on the right person being heard at the right time, then issues can slip through. And we've seen this, for example, with the NHS. If people have had concerns about surgeons or issues and they've not been heard, it can lead to the loss of life. So there are lessons that can be learned from this disaster that are important right across all different industries. Communication is incredibly important. Don't lose sight of the priorities. And for human spaceflight, that is keeping your crew safe, bringing them home safely. There may be times where you are having to make some very difficult decisions, and it'll be a matter of balancing several different things. And there will be times where you have to accept risk. It's just ensuring that when you're making those decisions about the level of acceptable risk, the person making the decision has to have all of the available information at their fingertips. And the launch officials that were making that final go for launch call on Challenger, they did not know that there had been dissenting views at Thiokol. And that was an issue that it sits with the management team at Thiokol, who decided to overrule their engineers that did have some concerns. That comes down to a number of things. I mean, not only was there pressure from NASA to be launching these space shuttles regularly and reliably, but also Thiokol themselves as a contractor, they faced a large fine, $10 million, if a launch was delayed because of their solid rocket boosters. And at the time of the disaster in 1986, their $800 million contract was up for renewal. The Challenger disaster really was a tragedy that rocked a nation, and especially with the teacher in space on board, with all those school children watching in their classrooms excitedly. And I think a lot of them will remember that moment until they die. It's a really harsh and stark reminder that we should never become complacent, especially when it comes to matters of life and death and human safety. Human spaceflight will never be safe. Space is hard, but there are things that we can do and processes that we need to ensure are working that will help to reduce the risk to the lowest possible number.
Why was it so difficult for NASA to postpone the launch despite the risks that had already been raised?
While we can say that the Challenger disaster was down to that issue with the O-rings, it's more than that. It's not just an engineering issue. This was an issue with the culture, the communications, perhaps getting used to the success of other space shuttle missions that they'd had. The level of proof required to persuade management to listen to what you were saying, and for them to believe it was enough to potentially delay a launch that had already been delayed and there was pressure to get it going. Also, with the penalties in place for Thiokol, if it was found that it was their solid rocket boosters that were delaying the launch, all of these things would have fed into the way that management made the decision. And it's interesting to think, if they were wearing their engineering hat rather than their management hat, might they have been swayed a slightly different way? Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but it's just really important for companies, especially when there's pressure to move fast. And if you've been doing things that are complicated, that require lots of tests and sign off, if everything's gone well for a long time, you might just get a bit used to that and not think so much about those risks that were there in the first place, the reasons that you put in all these checks and balances. So it's just really important to keep your eye on the mission. And in the case of NASA, that was keeping a crew safe